No, exactly. So on Apple, because I want to come back to the reindustrialization point, because I think that's an interesting conversation in its own right with respect to China. But as far as Apple's uncertainty here, do you have any sense for how complicated this could be? I mean, there was a report that Apple plans to shift more iPhone production to India to avoid US tariffs on Chinese goods, which threatens $70 billion that China earns annually from Apple. But the future looks cloudiest for them and perhaps Tesla after this week.
Yeah, I mean, Apple probably it's hard because on one hand, like this ecosystem sort of developed organically. On the other hand, Apple has also pushed this ecosystem forward, as I mentioned, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like Apple, and you see this in any sort of supplier. You see this with TSMC. Like, let's use TSMC as an example again. One of the reason why you have like the big five semiconductor equipment manufacturers, and they used to be more specialized in what they did. Now they all kind of do everything.
Yep.
And that's because TSMC continually sets them against each other because they don't want to have a single source supplier, right? TSMC doesn't like the situation where they have to pay ASML a bunch of money because they're the ones that make EUV. So when it comes to etching, when it comes to all mask making, when it comes to all these different pieces, they will say like, okay, we got this working with Lam Research, Tokyo Electronic. Why don't you get it to work too? Here's how you should do it. Here's XYZ. And they'll bring them up to speed, and then they go back to Lam Research, like, yeah, Tokyo Electronic actually figured it out too, believe it or not. So, and they're willing to offer this price. How about you lower your price here, right? And then, again, this is the way TSMC is at the center of everything. They get to, whoever is at the core of the value chain, they're the ones that get to sort of push their way around. This was sort of like Windows back in the day, right? Windows standardizing everything. They loved it when everything was competing with each other because that meant there was more PCs, right?
Yeah.
TSMC loves when their suppliers compete with each other. This is what Apple does with the iPhone. They do it everywhere in the iPhone. I brought up this just because this company I've always found interesting, Largan Precision, makes the lens assemblies for the iPhone. And I think one of the more egregious sort of Apple bits, if you're sort of an Apple customer, was Largan Precision dominated lens assemblies, and they were this tremendously successful Taiwanese company that had huge profit margins. I pointed out years ago, like they were worth almost as or like a fifth as much as Foxconn, despite the fact they made one component in the iPhone and Foxconn assembled the whole thing. Like just to speak to how valuable this could be, Apple hates this. Like every dollar that goes to Largan Precision
For the
is
love
a dollar
of God,
that hurts them. That's right.
Yeah.
And so Apple has been working for years to get an alternative Chinese supplier online here. And there was a bit where they there's lots of stuff that's not super clear here, but as I understand it, there was Largan Precision pushed forward to make a new 7 lens assembly instead of 6. And they had a committed partner in Huawei to buy it. The US kills Huawei's smartphone business. Suddenly they're like, oh no. They're like, well, Apple will buy it. Apple's like, you know what? We're getting really good at computational photography. We'll make 6 work, actually. And also, by the way, Sunny Optical in China has figured out how to make 6 lens assemblies. So let's get some negotiation on price here. And of course, Apple was the one pushing Sunny Optical to be able to do that. Now, this is one where Apple, it's not the best example because Apple did get burned. Sunny Optical had some real production problems. I don't know if this was combined to some of the issues they had with Face ID and stuff like that. This might be a different one. There was something that happened there too, I think, with a supplier. But basically, Largan ended up coming back, and they still dominate. But supposedly, Sunny Optical is going to be back this year in maybe some MacBook lenses or something like that. I don't know. But
the key takeaway is that Apple has been investing in Chinese competitors to
right. Another well-known one is Yangtze Memory, where Apple basically funded all the R&D and provide what was Apple? The reason for them to do this is Apple's a guaranteed buyer, and so Yangtze on this super advanced DRAM that would have given Apple an alternative supplier to SK Hynix and Micron, and memory is the most expensive component in an iPhone. It's very much in Apple's favor to have a Chinese memory supplier that's going to undercut these other suppliers. This was one where it got the US's attention. They're like, Apple, you'd better not buy memory from Yangtze. But the problem is all that R&D existed. Today, Yangtze is doing very well, or they're figuring out HBM, high bandwidth memory, which is important for AI chips. They're supplying Huawei. This is downstream of Apple investment. Like Apple wasn't investing in high bandwidth memory specifically; they were investing in Yangtze generally, which made them a much brought them up to speed as a competitor. And this is a very good example of how Apple wasn't doing anything wrong from a corporate perspective, but this was pretty damaging to. You talk about things like chip controls, right? Like you talk about things like drones. All these pieces of investing and pushing. And you can look, Apple puts out the supplier list for the iPhone every year, and Chinese companies used to be a minority. Now they're a majority. All by definition, that is replacing Taiwanese companies. That's replacing Japanese companies.
Suppliers.
That's replacing German companies, right? And Apple's doing it because they have the power. One more point on this. Demand controls supply. Apple promises massive demand and can bring to bear money to support that because they control demand. This gets into my whole thing about Intel, about chips, about how the US, the way you spur innovation is not by shoveling money, it's by the carrot of demand, but by bringing to bear that aspect. That's the point of the article generally. The US, there is an argument to remake trade for national security reasons, if nothing else. But you have to understand that it's not going back to the US. Formulate a sphere that you trust of influence and start directing things using demand and guaranteed buying. Like the US does have demand, and demand does control supply at the end of the day. The problem with these tariffs is it was demand destructive. It was destroying the US's capability, even as it was like an atomic bomb for China. But there is so yes, changes need to be done. Not this change. Leverage your demand. Lean into it.
Right. Well, let's talk about U.S. manufacturing, because Alex wrote in and said, I live in Cleveland, where I drive past hollowed out warehouses and factories every day. I desperately want to see new factories and jobs flooding into the Rust Belt, but it's unclear how these policies do that. Half of U.S. imports are used by U.S. manufacturing. Those imports just got more expensive, and they're going to translate to layoffs and reduce manufacturing output. How does shutting off U.S. manufacturing from the global supply chain address our strategic problems with China? So you wrote about this on Wednesday. How are you thinking about the problem that Alex highlights there? His email came in before the broad-based tariffs were paused for 90 days, but a lot of the manufacturing inputs come from China. So I don't think that problem goes away all of a sudden. But what do you think? How should that factor into the equation here?
Well, I mean, the problem with talking about this is you're sort of veering dangerously close to like centralized planning, right? It's like, we're going to choose to control here and control there. But with that sort of out of the way, that acknowledgement out of the way, you realize and identify what inputs you have that are dependent on China, and you put scheduled tariffs on those. These are going to be tariffed over time. And the problem with that is a schedule needs credibility. And I'm not sure this week did a lot to engender maybe fear of craziness. I'm not sure it did a lot to engender credibility. But at least sort of, so with that, another acknowledgement out of the way.
Well, it's theory, also, frankly, a challenge of the U.S. democratic system. Presidents change every 4 years. And so it's hard to.
Well, there's the whole question of, are these tariffs even constitutional, right? They are revenue driving. That's supposed to be Congress's job. They're being done under an emergency act authorization.
Seems like a broadened exercise of authority from President Trump the last couple of weeks. But
but I mean, it is kind of an emergency. We do have a national security problem, right? And so, that's a whole nother vein, which I'm not going to wade into about the constitutional questions. But what you do is you acknowledge, realize, identify. You start one channel to spur the creation of these capabilities in the U.S. or in a trusted ally. There does seem to be an overarching. You look at the list of trade numbers, all
Mm-hmm.
the like the 10% ones were like Anglosphere, the Americas, and like Middle East. Like that's kind of a signal, I think, of what the U.S. sees as its sphere, sort of in the long run, and to sort of shift that production. And this is the power of demand.
Yeah.
So you're on the China side. You're like, okay, they have this scheduled tariff. They're going to keep buying this from us, but they're clearly trying to usurp us. And you know what they're going to do? They're going to keep selling you the stuff, right?
They need
This is
customers.
think about like newspapers putting their stuff on Google or going onto Facebook, right? Like all the things that we talk about in the media. The power of an aggregator is you deliver so much demand that suppliers have to come to you on your terms, even though they hate it.
Yeah.
Now, again, this isn't an aggregation story. Aggregation is very explicitly about zero marginal cost items. Manufacturing items are not that. But the power of demand, this is hardly original to me. Like Keynes's whole thing was demand matters more than supply, right? But like the power of demand is, I think it's viable to actually have a structured plan that advertises the fact. The point of this plan is to diminish our reliance on China, which we have right now. So we're going to keep buying from China and buy parts from China to help us get away from China. And China's going to look at that and say, yeah, that really sucks. Well, guess we'll sell to you anyway because we have to sell. We have the factories. We have the capability. We rerouted our property bubble into export investments. Like we have to keep selling.
So here's my question though, because that seems to be in conflict with what you were laying out about binding China to the chips in Taiwan as a hedge against an invasion anytime soon.
Yeah, the chips thing is that's its own thing. Like that's the Trump card, no pun intended, that China has, and it's like the most horrific Trump card in the world because.
But I just mean in terms of like having an existential urgency in order to get some of these industries off the ground, maybe what's required to move forward, because it's not all that attractive as an investment.
Yeah. Yes, but I think chips are special. Chips are so essential, and we're so dependent on Taiwan that here you really do need, you ideally you want to bind. Look, the best thing for everyone, economically anyway, is that the system keeps. The reason why this is so hard is we have like a perfect system, right? Yeah. Asia makes all this stuff. We make all the software. Everyone gets rich. The U.S. gets richest of all. Like everything is amazing, except for the national security problem of us having total dependency on what I will call our peer and what you will call our enemy. And that's
adversary.
The fly
Let's
in
be
the
a
ointment.
little bit more diplomatic. But yeah,
well, I think that's implied in peer, right? It's not someone that we get to push around. And I think it's an important. I think peer would be a big step for the U.S. Like there's a lot of thought and thinking of China as this, upstart little brother, and they're not. Like they can make stuff that we can't, and a lot of that stuff has national security implications. And you look at things like AI is going to be manifested in the real world through robotics. Almost everything that goes into robotics, China dominates in. Like it's not just that we're challenged with what exists today. We're behind the eight ball when it comes to the future. And I think the way to solve that is to start out by admitting where we are. And when you admit where we are, that entails realizing that China has done tremendous things in these supply chains, has built up something that we can't just lift and take. It's actually a problem. And why this is going to require so much subtlety and long-term thinking, all of which is maybe a little fanciful to hope for. But look, I said at the end, cut China off, pull up the ladder on chips. It's depressing to me. I thought we were Americans. I thought we could have a can-do attitude. We're going to go settle the frontier. We're going to innovate. We're going to build new things. We're going to grow our way out. What Elon Musk is going to waste his time trimming Social Security pay? What a waste. Well, Elon Musk builds stuff. America builds stuff. Why aren't we trying to innovate and create new things and grow our way out of our problems? That's how we solve things in America. And so many of our solutions are all predicated on just cutting off protection, building up walls. That's not who we are. That's not who we've been. And I find it a bummer.